I think why this album was important to so many people is because it was a generation of British music which sincerely saw itself as a successor to the tradition of English music in general. It wanted to be. It saw how the Beatles grew to be considered just geniuses in the history of English language songwriting. The same could be said of. The same was being said by the 1980s of Mick Jagger / Keith Richards and Ray Davies, maybe even David Bowie by that point. And so, acts like the Smiths, Morrissey, they wanted their place in that canon as well. And for fans of the Smiths, fans of the indie rock boom of the 1980s, fans of the NME generation, I guess, they wanted a world wherein they could have an album of their own, where their generation could have an album that matched with the songwriting prowess, the poetry extraordinaire of prior generations of English history, and not only that, could trumpet. The Queen is Dead was an album from a generation of music fans who expected their parents to dismiss all of their music as tasteless, undignified, uneducated claptrap. But then what would happen if you sat your grandparents down with The Queen is Dead, with Morrissey's baritone, his gorgeous lyrics, the profoundly stirring arrangements and the musical imagination of the compositions, the way they match the words, Morrissey's vocals. How could they deny this was some of the most beautiful music in a very traditional sense within the history of English language songwriting? Whilst it was reliant on a contemporary production, a circa 1986, it wasn't the full gamut. It certainly wasn't employing technology like synthesizers and drum machines in a way that could potentially make the album feel dated. If anything, The Queen is Dead has aged superlatively well compared to other albums of its ilk. This came out the same year as, for example, Peter Gabriel's So, with Genesis' Invisible Touch. This has aged far better. Or even something like the next year, but Tutu's The Joshua Tree. The Queen is Dead has aged far better than those, sonically. And it's not going to be for everyone either. I explained in a video on The Cure's Disintegration how I didn't buy Robert Smith's depression in the same way that Morrissey just genuinely seemed anhedonic and as though he needed some sort of medical supplement, or even better, a magic button that one could press and just make him better forever. Because, I mean, I've heard Morrissey describe in interviews how the little suburb town he grew up in, all those buildings and the surroundings, it was demolished at one point in his early life. He feels as though his childhood was just kind of destroyed, taken away from him, and then they moved them all into this flat, this industrial kind of estate, council housing on the other side of the river, as a lot of the British punk, post-punk, indie rock era artists, Gen X, they all talk about this being a very formative and influential moment upon their lives, and how it kind of destroyed their hopes of having the beautiful English lifestyle that the previous generations had written about, and that they were seemingly promised. The post-war consensus wound up being this bureaucratic nightmare of the 1970s, and then there was the Thatcher era of the 1980s. The Smiths wound up being a perfect soundtrack for those who yearn for something more romantic, something more magical about the place they refer to as England. It's also very lofty, but I'd be lying if I said that Morrissey never ever enchanted me. Oh, never had no one ever enchanted me like Mr. Stephen Morrissey has. Every now and again I claim to a friend that there are barely any good lyrics in recorded music. The fact that we claim Bob Dylan deserved a Nobel Prize in poetry is absurd. My friend would claim, well, what about Morrissey? Well, yeah, of course Morrissey's good, but that's different. Yeah, it's not... I'm quite a fan of his work with the Smiths. I found his solo work more difficult to enjoy. I don't know if it's just... I think you do need the punchy music to get you in, so you're in a place where you want to appreciate his lyrics. I'm not going to get into the positions he's held of late. I suppose it's unfortunate. It's his prerogative to a degree, although he's become ignorant to the sense of desperation and the will to life which defines the human species, and he's also become ignorant of how damaging a public figure's opinions can be, and whilst it's not wrong for a citizen to hold certain views, if not just in private, to megaphone these in public can have catastrophic consequences. It's just not worth it. And something about expressing hatred in general, even if it didn't have any consequences in the real world, let's say everyone just brushed off someone's hateful comments and that was the end of it, there's still a certain anguish and despair about someone whom expressed such soulful and evocative emotions resorting to something so base and unimaginative is hatred. I happen to think this is a beautiful album still. It impresses me every time I listen to it. I can play it on many different occasions, and I can play it for most individuals, and unless they have a particular disdain toward music that's so traditional and kind of lofty, they might refer to it as whiny young indie music, or the inverse, but still the same kind of boring old grandma music, both sides of the coin in a way. Although it's amazing. Take an album like this, it's an album of music that might be considered brushed off as emo, which I can also play in the company of my father, who is an enormous fan of Marty Robbins, for example, and that classic Gunfighter Ballads LP, which was apparently in every other Australian household at one time, according to him. And I think an album like The Queen is Dead demonstrates how two different generations are ultimately seeking after the same qualities within their recorded music LPs. These beautiful storylines, these majestic lyrics, and these soaring musical arrangements. You cannot go wrong. I don't even blame Enemy for claiming this was the greatest album of all time. It was a statement, it was them trying to be edgy and provocative, although it's such a brilliant piece of work. I can only get so annoyed by it, honestly. Some of you might be thinking, oh no, the Smiths, what garbage. He's championing some pretty rubbish music here. Well, I can't convince you otherwise, although you can't help me from pitying that you don't know or cannot experience the beauty of this act. You're probably thinking, if it means saving myself from becoming a fool like you, absolutely. I'm happy to be a fool for the Smiths. I really am.